to redistribute to the poor is to like subsidize fuel or subsidize some particular type of food, right? And this is kind of crazy because the truth is it's not even that obvious that the poor are consuming more of that stuff than other things. You could just give the money directly to the poor people, let them choose what they're going to do, rather than like having them buy a ton of gasoline and drive all over the place, which isn't necessarily what they need to be doing anyways with the money. So it's a very inefficient way to redistribute resources to just subsidize some random commodities that you think that the poor might buy, rather than just giving money directly to poor people. And to the extent that there should be subsidies on the prices of any good or taxes, it should be based on a much more subtle logic. So it should be based more on the idea that if there are certain things that allow you to redistribute without discouraging people from working harder, you should do it that way. So for example, if you give education or job training to the poor, that's not going to be useful to them unless they decide to work. It's not going to be useful to them if they're just going to live off of welfare. So that might be a better way to redistribute. You might want to subsidize the price of education, but that's not because it's some random thing like fuel. It's because it specifically encourages people to work, even though it also transfers money to people who are less well off. On the other hand, you might want to tax something that the rich who are lazy do. So, for example, you might want to tax some types of luxurious vacations that playboys take, or like tax yachts, and not tax things that more sort of sober rich people do. Okay. So, you probably, in the last quarter of this class, and so far in this lecture, have interpreted the welfare theorems as like ways of saying that the market is really efficient, and that we should just sort of leave the market alone, right? And that's how they're often interpreted. But that's not how they've always been seen. And in fact, some people have used the market, the welfare theorems, as a way to argue for socialism. So, Alexandra? Is that Alexandra? Yeah. Could you describe why the welfare theorems could be interpreted?
But, so the planner can just like kind of artificially construct the market.
Exactly. Exactly. We were just saying that there's all these cases that have nothing to do with the market where we can use the market. Why do we even need a market? We can just, like in my financial thing, people don't have to be participating at all. We can just have a computer do it all. And that could be run by the government, right? There's no reason why it should be done by the market. And in fact, if people are sort of, we know that markets can be inefficient in all sorts of ways. There can be market power, monopolies. There can be externalities. People can be really bad at making decisions about their financial lives. There can be public goods, right? And so wouldn't it be much more efficient just to have a big computer like I was talking about, making all the decisions, rather than having people make them in these decentralized ways? And so socialism should be more efficient. It should get rid of all the inefficiencies of the market, but keep all of its benefits, right? And while it's true that the welfare theorems say don't do stupid stuff like randomly subsidizing fuel for no particular reason, you could also interpret them as saying don't deviate from the optimal social plan by a socialist economy either, right? So what it really warns against is sort of stupid local deviations. It doesn't warn against like changing the whole economy over to being managed by the government rather than being managed by the private sector. And so as a result of that, you should not interpret the welfare theorems as in any way favoring the market economy over socialism. They really just don't say anything about that. They say that everything the market can do can be done by a central government planner. Everything that a central planner can do can be done by the market. It's completely neutral. And all the market failures we're going to talk about are going to say that a planner can do better than the market can do. So, why the heck do economists like markets so much, if that's the case? Yeah, go ahead. Michael, why do economists favor markets then, or what was Hayek's argument for what markets are
He
doing?
argued that because there's he had sort of 2 main points, there's a lot of local information
Yeah,
that the government's never going to find out.
yeah,
And then the price, when individuals are making decisions, prices can send them information
yeah.
about stuff like goods. They have no way to really know, but the price tells them what to do and they'll react accordingly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the famous argument that was made by Mises and von Mises and Hayek, were that in order to make decisions, as a centralized planner, you need a massive amount of information. And wouldn't it make just a lot more sense for each individual just to look at the prices? That's very simple. That's all the information that the individual needs, and then the individual can figure out their own cost curve, or demand curve, and figure out how to set that equal to the prices in the market, rather than society having to collect all the demand curves and figure out how to put them all together. And so a natural question is, how could the planner, without prices, figure all these things out? So an example from von Mises is, imagine trying to build a railroad. And you're trying to decide, should the railroad go around the mountain, or should it go through the mountain? Well, what are the advantages of going through the mountain? Well, it would be faster. You might save some steel on the railroads to go around. On the other hand, it's going to cost a lot of wood and labor to build the tunnel compared to what it would take to build it around. And that requires you to make trade-offs between what is the relative value of all these different things. And how could a central government ever know all the stuff that it would need to figure that out? In the market economy, you would look at what are the relative prices of these different things, but in the socialist economy, you don't have that. And so it would require doing some enormous calculation where you take into account exactly what's going on in the wood market, what's going on in the, in all, there would need to be a market. It would just, you'd have to figure out how much steel do we have, how much wood do we have. I mean, you'd have to do this enormous calculation. And so the benefit of the market is that it conveys to other people this basic information they need to know, these prices, without requiring a centralization of all the local knowledge that people have about things like how to build the railroad here and so forth. So the market is fundamentally an aggregator of information. It's a process that puts together all the different information. And that's the reason that despite all the distortions of the market, all the monopoly and so forth that we'll learn about in the rest of the course, markets can be valuable. The famous story about this is that nobody knows how to make a pencil. Why does nobody know how to make a pencil? Well, there's someone who maybe knows how to mine the ore that eventually goes into the pencil. There's another person who knows how to cut down the trees. But then someone else needs to know how to get the trees to the factory. And someone else needs to know how to get the ore to the factory. And someone else needs to know how to cut down the tree and make it into the shape of the pencil holder. And then someone else needs to know how to attach them to one another. So all those are things that no individual person could tell you anything about all of those things. Each person knows only one small part of it. But because the market system tells them all the prices, they can figure out just their little part, how to do that the best, and leave everything else to someone else. So, therefore, if the main costs of markets are all these market failures we talked about, their main benefit is that they allow the delegation of information and decisions to very many different people. So, what we'll see throughout this course is this is really like the key trade-off that determines so many things throughout economics. So, for example, how much wealth should we redistribute? On the one hand, the market leads to a very inequitable distribution of wealth. Some people get a lot, other people get very little. But the problem is we don't know what people's potential incomes are, as I was saying. And so in order to redistribute, we have to tax income, and that can be very costly because it can discourage people from working hard, right? So if we knew what everyone's ability was, we would redistribute a lot more than we actually do. So similarly, we'll talk about monopoly, and in the context of monopoly, we would often like to regulate the firm to charge a price that's equal to marginal cost, because that's much more efficient. But that can be very hard because the company might know what its costs are much better than the government does, and that can make it very hard to regulate them. So that's going to be a big trade-off we'll face. Another thing is that, often to reward innovation, we give patents. But as we talked about on Tuesday, patents can be very costly because they give someone a monopoly and they lead to a higher price, right? And therefore they lead to underconsumption of the good. So a better way to do it might be to use a prize system, where we just give someone a prize if they come up with a great invention, and then we let everyone use it, right? But the problem with that is, how do we know how much of a prize to give to different innovations, right? The great thing about a patent is you only make money if someone actually wants to use the product, right? So because we don't have the information, we have to accept the inefficiency of monopoly in order to take advantage of the information that people have. Another example, sort of in the opposite direction, is how much information do we give consumers? Do we put on certain foods just like a big red flashing light saying this is terrible for your health? Or do we put very specifically the calories and the iron and all these different things? Well, there's trade-offs. On the one hand, if the consumer knows a lot about exactly what type of thing that they're trying to get, it makes sense to give them a lot of information. On the other hand, if the consumer is kind of ignorant and isn't really making good decisions, it might be much better to put a very blunt warning label on the thing, right? So the key thing is in economics is to figure out who should be deciding what, when, and how. So we'll see that there's all sorts of ways in which markets and individuals make mistakes and misallocate resources. But we'll also see how hard it is for the government to get the information that it needs in order to correct those problems. And so the optimal degree of government intervention is going to depend on balancing between these two things. And some of the interventions aren't necessarily done by the government directly itself. The key thing is how centralized are decisions. So if you think about Netflix has basically centralized within a market the process of deciding what movies people watch to some extent, right? A lot of people, they just take whatever Netflix recommends to them. So it used to be that the way you figured out your movies, you talked to a bunch of friends, you used all this local knowledge, you figured out what the best movie was. Now Netflix has basically centralized that process and knows what movies you want to watch better than you know for yourself, right? And so the key thing is not, is the government doing it or is the private sector doing it, but whether it makes sense to do things in a centralized way or in a decentralized way. By centralizing things, you can avoid a lot of the inefficiencies, but you also lose that local information. And most of these decisions are therefore not qualitative things where it's just, hey, the government does things badly and the private sector and the market economy do them well. It's in this particular situation, how much information is there and how much distortion is there and how do we trade those things off? How do we measure the differences between those? And that will help us figure out who should make what decisions about what things, when, and where. And that's going to really be the focus in the coming weeks. But I hope that the course will teach you to be much less ideological about these things, not just say markets work well, government works poorly, but rather to think, in this particular situation, what is the most important type of information, who has it, and how do we make sure that it's able to be acted on with the least loss of social welfare. And that's really what it means to be an economist. So now you have a few minutes. Make sure you get one of these forms to fill out.